Welcome to the Impact webcast series on growing a business. I'm Dr. Cindy Mencius, the Impact Director of Contractor Training and Development. The goal of the webcast series on growing a business is to provide our contractors with information, tools, and resources that they can use to start, grow, and improve their business. Today's webcast subject is financial indicators, and our presentation title is Key Performance Indicators. Our instructor is Ken Roper, Principal with FMI Corporation. Ken has been implementing profitable growth strategies with construction companies across the country for the past 30 years. His competitive drive, industry experience, and unique background blend strategy development and organizational efficiency into establishing market leadership for contractors. Ken is one of our instructors for Impact's Business Fundamentals Academy Track 1. He teaches a module on financial management for contractors and a module on collections and getting paid. The Business Fundamentals Academy is an intensive week-long course designed to increase the basic business knowledge of our current, new, or startup contractors. For more information about the program, please visit the Impact webpage. Ken, thank you for addressing our Impact members today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. To start off with, let me tell you a little bit about FMI. FMI was founded about 63 years ago and has been operating in the construction industry since that time. Our founder, Doc Fales, was a professor of accounting at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And one of the things he used to say was that contractors do three things. They get work, they do work, and they keep score. And this particular presentation that we're going to talk about today is in that scorekeeping area. One of the things that we've found over the years working with contractors is that they have difficulty understanding income statements, balance sheets, key financial ratios, and how to interpret their performance. And we have worked intentionally to try and simplify some of those concepts, make them a little more visual and meaningful to the contractors in the industry. And so this presentation, Key Performance Indicators, really involves a project that was devoted or started by Microsoft Business Solutions, FMI, and a gentleman by the name of Craig Ward. Craig was a contractor for a number of years, and Microsoft, of course, everybody knows who they are, and FMI has been around the construction industry. But the things that we really tried to address, let's get some common performance metrics other than the normal financial ratios that you might see in the financial management area. But the objective of the KPIs really were to define behaviors that drive successful contractors and to help them build a roadmap for the operations that they run, and what are some of the things that they can do to improve their operations. And also integrate people, process, and technology, because technology plays a huge role today in construction. As I mentioned, FMI has been around the construction industry a long time. Craig Ward has been in the construction world for about 20 years, and he was a part of this team as well. So what do the most profitable contractors measure? And it said what is measured is managed. And let's talk about upstream measurements versus downstream measurements for a minute. So upstream measurements are things that tend to drive behaviors more specifically. And so upstream measurements, if you were thinking about a weight loss program, maybe this is a good example. It's more about the calories that you intake versus the weight on a scale. So the weight on the scale is more of a downstream measurement. That's the result. That's the outcome. The upstream measurement is how many calories you're intaking. And to contrast that or compare that with construction, we're trying to focus on those things and measuring those things that will drive the right behavior. And so driving the right behavior is really what we intended to do when we started this Key Performance Indicator project. And provide long-term solutions with higher returns. You know, what are those activities that contractors really need to focus on that do make a big difference in the return on investment? And if we increase the return on investment for contractors, it typically builds value for these construction firms. And also, again, to integrate people, process, and technology. So what are the best practices to help the contractors cope with escalating complexity and competition? If you think about the construction industry for a minute, it's a mature industry. It's got lots of competition. I mean, there isn't a market in a country today that doesn't have lots of competition. And more companies to survive are having to focus on operational excellence. And what can they do also that will help them build differentiation in the marketplace? What are the things that are unique to that company that will drive customers to buy from their organization as opposed to their competitors? And so the goal was to create specific superior performance producing a competitive advantage. What are some of those things that really are going to differentiate a firm from one of the competitors or the other competitors in the marketplace? So we wanted to identify the organization performance at a glance, something that's visual. We have found that contractors, sometimes if they see two numbers on a page, will get a rash. The analysis and the stacks of paper that we tend to provide, all these financial analysis, really are kind of cumbersome and not so easy to draw conclusions from. So we felt it was important for you to view the KPIs as a group, but also have some visual presence to them so that there was ease of computation from existing information and also a summary level drill down capability so that you could go from the summary level down to the specific detail that was involved on the particular project or circumstance that you were looking at. And also help, because they're behavior based, what are the actionable steps then to improve the performance? What are the things that these indicators are working towards? We think it was superior to financial performance because a lot of people don't have financial training and don't really understand the financial ratios. And also one of the things that makes them a little more cumbersome is that they're very downstream oriented. In other words, the results, they're just showing the results of the operation as opposed to some of the behaviors that need to be changed or things operationally upstream that can be changed to improve the financial performance. So these are the key performance indicators that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the liquidity indicator. We're going to talk about a schedule variance indicator. We're going to talk about work in process indicators. If you think about it, the heart of a construction financial statement is that work in process. And so we're going to spend a lot of time on work in process indicators. And those include margin variance indicator, labor productivity indicator, unapproved change order indicator, committed cost indicator, backlog indicator, and project delivery indicator. So those are the ones that we're going to cover today and talk about in terms of key performance indicators. So this first one is what we call the liquidity indicator, and everybody knows how important cash is in a construction firm. And so it really identifies cash generated or applied to project execution. And it originates from key asset and liability accounts that are impacted in the project execution process. So these are accounts that project management teams actually have control over during the project process. And why liquidity is so important? Because obviously positive cash flow results from superior project management. Liquidity is required by all contractors, not just general contractors, but all contractors, and the number one cause of bankruptcy obviously is the running out of cash. And it integrates key components of financial management so that makes it a little simpler for people to understand what it takes to generate positive cash flow in the construction industry. It also, if we have high liquidity and a solid balance sheet, it increases the credit and bonding capacity of the firm. It creates opportunities for cash management and utilization and promotes owner financing of projects. So one of the questions we always ask contractors is, who's financing your projects? And the answer ought to be, we're financing those with our work in process and through our billing process, and the owner of the project is actually financing the project. So the liquidity indicator looks like this, and it really does. It's a summary. We're going to go to the details of this in just a minute, but in a quick snapshot, you can see that in this particular case, the days cash provided is somewhere between 15 and 25 days. On the left side, those are positive indicators, and on the right side, those are negative indicators. We want cash being provided from operations and not used in operations. On the right side, where you have positive numbers, those are really negative. And so that's the amount of cash that's needed for operation. And this comes from this particular set of numbers that we used to calculate the liquidity indicator. And it starts with the current assets. And if you think about it for a minute, project managers manage accounts receivable, retainages receivable, and underbillings. And that total is what we call the cash conversion. And in other words, you start with $1 of cash, you put it into a work in process, you work it through the work in process, you actually get it billed. Some of it goes to retainage and some of it goes to receivable. But that whole cash conversion process results in about, in this case, $14 million of cash that's being applied to operation. So on the right side, what we have then, and this is one of the other advantages of this particular approach, is that you can see the number of days cash that's being stored up in each one of the accounts. So take the revenue, in this particular case, contract revenue, divided by 365 gives you the daily total. And for accounts receivable, right now we have 52 days in accounts receivable. The comparison then for Risk Management Associates is a financial organization that accumulates financial data by SIC code or NSIC code and gives these ratios for various firms of the very similar types. And you can see the top quartile in this particular case is 40 days. So our contractor with 52 days is a little bit higher than that. So he's more of a median contractor as compared with his peers. And the lower quartile is 71 days. So you can see that from the top quartile to the bottom is a pretty significant variance. And one of the things we point out about working with this in the construction industry is to make sure that you work on trying to be in the top quartile. The top quartile performs significantly better than just being average in the construction industry. We found that generally speaking, the general contractors that are in the top quartile or 3 to 5% higher in terms of net income before tax. Subcontractors sometimes can be as high as 5 to 8% higher than the average in terms of best of class. And so we're always trying to get construction firms to compare themselves to the top quartile. So in this particular example, we've got cash being tied up in operations, and you can see the number of days. You can see the number of days of retentions in receivables, and you can see the number of underbillings. The cash conversion process then total. And the liabilities then provide the financing for that asset accumulation. So you've got accounts payable. Vendors and subcontractors are providing financing. Accounts payable retention, and again, those are vendors and subcontractors. And then overbillings, which is contractors that have good aggressive schedule of values are able to stay ahead of the project in terms of the cost and the billing, and so they're able to overbill. In this case, we have about $17 million of cash funding for the construction process. And so you can see when you compare the liability side to the asset side, we actually have a positive variance here of about $3.6 million, which means that the funding is providing the cash for the asset accumulation in the accounts receivable, retainage receivable, and underbillings. And that's how we end up with a negative 23 days. And again, you can look at the comparison of the accounts payable. In this particular case, the days accounts receivable are 30 or 44 for the top quartile. And that is a little bit low, so they probably have some opportunity there for some additional funding. And then the accounts receivable retainage is about 51 days, and then the overbillings is 33 days. So a total of 114 days being provided there of funding. So the goal here is to make sure that the overbillings and the accounts payable and the accounts payable retention provide the cash to sustain the asset portion, which is the current asset. Here's one that's got a negative 15-day variance, and you can see that it's positive. We did this comparison with a group of peer group members in a recent meeting that we had with them. There was 8 contractor peer group, electrical contractors, and they all compared their liquidity ratios. And only one of them had a significantly negative indicator, meaning that it was providing cash from operation to the extent of about $30 million. And the other contractors all had positive. And so you could see that their work in process and the way that they were managing their project was consuming cash at a much higher rate. Needless to say, the 7 are working hard to get to the negative situation where they've got cash being provided by operations. And some of that's impacted by the type of contractors, the type of contracts that you enter into, like time and material. Some are using cost plus. Those are a little more difficult to get overbillings on, but generally most contractors, even with those type, set up schedule of values that really are in their favor and that they can stay ahead of on the overbilling part of the construction process. This is the numbers for another positive indicator, and you can see where the actual cash funding is now less than the cash conversion process, meaning that the current assets are consuming cash because the funding is not sufficient there. But the liquidity indicator, again, the whole goal is to try and get contractors thinking about billing their projects aggressively, setting up aggressive schedule of values so that they're overbilled, so that the cash is coming in to fund the work in process. Anytime we see a significant underbilling in a construction balance sheet, we always say that that's a contractor's investment in the project. And part of their pricing strategy very seldom includes the cost of financing the project for the owner. So trying to emphasize overbillings here. The schedule variance indicator is another one that originates from project scheduling, and it's expressed as project days as a % of remaining duration. And why that's important, first of all, a lot of construction firms don't use this valuable tool to really manage their projects. They'll submit a schedule at inception, and it's required by the owners that they have one. But then during the life of the contract, they will not update the schedule for changes and reflect the different conditions that occur on the job site. And therefore, the tool kind of loses its value because it's not current and it's not updated. We believe that if you set this schedule up at the beginning of a project, that you man load and cost load your project schedules, you'll be able to determine what some of those things are that you can do to front load or aggressively bill and overbill on your projects. And it also will enable you to do some important things regarding project delivery dates. It helps with communication with the owner if you've got an accurate schedule and know right where you are and what's going to be required to finish. And it identifies the risks and potential claims that may be arising on a project. So this always creates an opportunity for schedule and workforce coordination and integration with all of the players on the project. And some of the best practices involve setting this schedule up at the very beginning of the process. So we saw a contractor that used what we call a planning charrette process. And what they did at the beginning of that process was to get all the key players involved in the contract, the owner, the architect, the engineer, general contractor, and all the key subs. And they all sat around a table, and for 2 days they worked on the project schedule. And they worked on constructability issues, resolving problems with design, resolving problems with architecture. Lots of decisions had to be made. But at the end of the process, all of the contractors walked out and had signed the schedule that they were committed to keeping. And how well do you think that project was executed? And quite successful in that particular case. And most contractors will tell you to the extent they spend more time planning, scheduling, and coordinating up front, it is invaluable in terms of project execution and making the project execution successful. So it improves the owner communication. It also identifies the risks and potential claims. It creates opportunities for schedule and workforce coordination, as we said. So here's a schedule variance indicator. And the computations on this are, negative numbers are good, again, just like the liquidity indicator. And the negative numbers are computed like this. You take the original project duration in days minus the revised project duration in days, and you divide it by the total remaining duration on the project. And so that's how those computations are calculated. And so, for example, a positive indication would be, let's say that the original project duration was 120 days, and minus the revised project duration, which is now 140 days, and then divide that by the total remaining project duration, which in this example is 60 days. And so that would result in a positive 33% variance. Conversely, if you had 120 days, original project duration minus 110 days, which is the revised project duration, it's actually shortened, and divide by the total remaining project, which would be 60 days, that's a 16.7% negative variance. But then this is computed job by job, and you can see how projects are performing according to the actual schedules that have been prepared for these projects. If you don't have schedules for the projects, you can see what a problem that will present. And so, again, the behavior we're trying to drive here is schedule preparation, schedule updates, and maintenance. And then there are some things that can drive off that schedule. If you have a project schedule that's prepared, you can do short interval schedules, which are sometimes 2 or 3 weeks look-aheads is what we call them. And then from those short schedule or short interval schedules, you can then build daily goal setting to meet the production goals so that you're on track. But the schedule variance and staying on track with schedules is key today, because everybody knows there's schedule compression, and generally things need to be completed sooner rather than later. So that's an important process. We've also done surveys of owners, and they've all felt that some of the scheduling process could be enhanced to improve schedule performances. So here's some other work in process overview. So these are things that identify project execution compared to budgets and organizational objectives. They drive behavior and increase project margin and mitigate risk. They improve project communication, and they provide early warning for performance variances if there are any that exist. And they create actionable steps for improvement, because you can begin to see where these variances are occurring. So let's talk about labor productivity for a minute. This identifies the labor productivity rate, and it's estimated versus actual. And the concept is earned value, which is a really important concept in construction. And so if you think about it in the context of, if we've estimated that something's going to take about 100 hours to perform, then we should be able to install it at that rate. And it should be tracking exactly with what we've estimated, and that's in the ideal world. But you need to know, first of all, what are the actual production rates? How are we doing relative to our estimates? So it's the typical two. This is the other thing about labor factor. Labor is one of the highest risk factors in construction, and managing labor is really an important concept. And for subcontractors in particular, this is one of the most important things. It also is a very useful tool once you have labor productivity tracking and earned value analysis, that it helps you with your cost to complete and knowing where you are relative to what it's going to actually take to finish that job. And it also helps you understand your daily production goals and establishes historical cost basis for future estimates. What do things take to install, and are we tracking with that? Is a very important concept in construction. That's the behavior we're trying to track. So you can see that there's some good productivity indicators here and some poor ones. The good ones are the ones that are in purple. Anything that has a productivity rate of greater than 1 means that we're installing work at a favorable rate relative to our estimate. Anything that has a lower than 1 productivity rate means that that particular project is behind schedule in terms of what we estimated in terms of production rates. And so you can see that there's some good ones and some bad ones on this productivity indicator. And this can be done on a by job basis, on a phase basis, or by company basis to determine how we're doing on our labor productivity. And it originates from the original project job cost report comparing budget to actual performance on all projects. But in order to do that accurately, you've got to know the quantities installed. So it's not just knowing the labor, quantity of labor that went into a particular phase or task on an estimate, but also what was the quantities installed. So it tracks labor compared to the quantities installed, so we're getting production rates. And it provides for margin enhancement and corrective action. If we've got situations that need to be corrected, we can take action on those. One of the things that occurs in construction quite frequently is what we call the bad job. And we really want to avoid those bad jobs, but usually you can tell in the first 25 to 30% of a project that it's not going the way that it should. And so what we're trying to avoid is those situations where we just have disastrous results on a project. And many of the contractors we've worked with have had jobs where they've actually written checks for to complete, and that's a real bad situation that we don't want for our contractors. Here's another one. This is the margin variance indicator, and it really tracks the total margin for the job compared with what the estimated margin was. In this particular case, we have a business goal objective of around 18% margin on our jobs. And we've got completed jobs, some that are less than that, some that are above that, and then we've got some uncompleted jobs that are kind of tracking above the trend line. And one of the things that we always try and avoid is that margin fade at the end. And contractors that really don't understand their cost or don't really understand earned value, a lot of times have trouble with margin fade at the end of a project. And what it means is they're not really assessing what the productivity rates are, what the work installed rate is, and that the margin is going to fade at the end of the project. The better contractors, the best of class contractors, tend to be a little more conservative, and at the end of their projects, they'll have actual write-ups on projects where the margin goes up on the job. And so what we're really trying to track here is just what's happening with each particular margin, whether it's completed or uncompleted, and are we gaining or fading on our margins? And that margin indicator takes into account all costs on a project. Here's another one of, you can just kind of see where that is. The cash flow indicator, as opposed to the liquidity indicator, really tracks positive cash flow on projects. And it's generated from receipts and disbursements. It's a non-GAAP or non-generally accepted accounting principle measurement, but it really does track what's happening with cash flow on a project. And so it kind of does identify the cash flow and some of the things that can be enhanced to improve cash flow. One of the things people think that we encourage contractors to do is to not pay their payables, to use the payables as a financing means. And I've got several examples where this can be a very strategic area. One of my contractors paid their bills within 10 days, and whether they were paid or not. And so when other contractors were having difficulty getting pipe supplies, this particular contractor, who was a utility contractor, didn't have any trouble getting supplies. And they also got preferential pricing. So their fact that they were paying their payables early really was a strategic advantage. And conversely, there is a standard terms 210 net 30. Sometimes those discounts you want to take and make sure that you're taking those discounts. A 210 net 30 discount translates to about a 36% annual rate of return. So you want to make sure you take your discounts. And then also another thing about these cash flow, just knowing where you are on a project, it again tries to promote the owner finance projects. We want to make sure that the owners are paying for the projects. So you can see the cash flow then on these projects. So we've got some with positive cash flow and some with negative cash flow. And then some of those that are just for the average jobs. So you've got various cash flow indicators here for this company. Another indicator which is really important is unapproved change orders. There are a lot of change orders in the construction industry that are delayed or held up and not approved. And whatever happens on these is that most of the strategy on that is that we'll wait till the end of the job, then we'll negotiate all of them at once. And generally when that happens, you get less than 100% of the change orders. And so we want to make sure that during the construction process that we're submitting and getting all change orders approved so that we can get them billed and collected. Because even if they're not approved, chances are that the construction has already taken place, the costs being incurred, and it will show up as an underbilling if they don't get those change orders approved. And so it minimizes project margin fade, because these change orders that get negotiated at the end are not as large and usually have to be negotiated down. And it creates margin enhancement and corrective actions if there's a problem getting these approved. Also, we don't want to keep things from the owners, so this enhances owner communication. We want them to know what things are being done on their project and what the cost of those things are, and involve them in the decision process. So you can see here that on a total of about $7.5 million, that we've got about $1.2 million of unapproved change orders. And so that represents a risk to the construction firm. And the total cost incurred on the unapproved change orders is in the blue, and the total forecasted margin is in the red. Committed cost indicator is another significant area for opportunities, because we want to make sure that at project inception we're executing the buyout. And what that means is that we get purchase commitments during the buyout process, and you can see where this happens from the estimate. Estimate will reflect all of the materials that need to be purchased and all the subcontractors that need to be issued. And so we look at the job cost report, and we can tell what costs have been bought out or purchased and what costs yet to be bought out. And why that's important is because it represents a risk, particularly in some of the like electrical trades where copper. We had an example where a contractor executed a purchase contract at the beginning of a large high-rise project. And because they had done it when they did it, they actually saved $1 million in material cost, because the price of copper over the next year escalated significantly. And had they not executed that purchase order, the cost of their materials would have been $1 million more than it was. And so it identifies the status of current purchases and where we are, and it limits the exposure to price fluctuations for commodity prices and materials, and especially today when commodity prices are so volatile and material shortages can occur. And it generates opportunities again for gross margin enhancement. That contractor that bought the copper would have lost $1 million in margin had they not executed that purchase order. And it improves project coordination. So here is the committed cost indicator. You can see that the blue is the total available committed cost, and that the maroon is the total committed costs on contracts in progress. So we still have about $10.8 million of outstanding uncommitted costs. So the work in process summary, and again, these totals are to help with stability and gross margins, to improve project cash flow, to make sure that we've got good change order processes in place, and that we're executing efficiently on the projects. We're trying to manage the risk in terms of committed cost and outstanding change orders. Hopefully it increases stakeholder satisfaction because of the lower risk and the higher returns, and gives us more predictable outcomes. It also adds to the communication and teamwork, because these are very visual and you can see some of the things that can be done to improve project performance. But it's the heart of the construction process, so we want to make sure that we have all of those things in place and working efficiently. Here's a couple more that we think are really important, because contractors are always bidding work. They're always running out of their backlog, so to speak. So the backlog indicator really identifies that future work that they have on their books, and it originates from the job cost reports, and it tells you, based on the number of dollars of signed work and the revenue that we've earned, minus the estimated cost of that, what is the margin that we've earned to date, and what do we have left in our backlog to earn? And so it helps them manage the volume of their business. And one of the biggest problems we've seen with construction firms sometimes is we'll ask them about a particular project they're bidding and say, well, I really got to have this job. Anytime we hear that, that's a real cause for concern, because Those are jobs that they tend to bid tight. They tend to be very optimistic about the productivity rates, and all of a sudden they've got a job that they can't match their productivity on, and it becomes one of those bad jobs we talked about earlier. And so managing backlog is a really important aspect of managing profitability for construction firms, and it helps them identify gross margin on future projects, the effectiveness of their business development efforts, knowing what work's getting signed up, knowing how much margin they have on that work. And it impacts project pricing and project targeting, because if they've got lots of backlog, contractors oftentimes increase their pricing, and even some of those increased prices will be accepted in the marketplace. And it also makes sure that they're managing the workforce effectively, which today is a real problem because we've got limitations on workforce and availability of people. And you want to make sure that the backlog matches the workforce that you have in place. The best contractors never ever take work that they don't have a seasoned project manager for or a superintendent to run the job. And so taking jobs that you can't staff is one of those causes for the bad jobs we talked about earlier. And here's the backlog indicator. You can see that the blue part is the current gross profit in backlog. The purple or maroon is proposed. And then the top bar is just kind of historical. This is what we've estimated and historically we've gotten. But you can kind of see what happens as you get further into the future. There's less backlog. And so the contractors also have a line in there. The red line represents their monthly G&A. They can see when they're really going to need some projects to make sure they maintain their profitability. So that's a pretty good indicator. And then the final one that we want to talk about, which is just a more subjective measure, which is project delivery scorecard indicator. And what this does is it measures some qualitative success factors on projects. And it's generated in the project management process based on the identification of weighting factors, success factors. And why this is important is the foundation for continuous improvement of soft skills. It helps qualification and quantification of project skill gaps, if we've got any, and identifies compliance with processes and procedures. So here are some examples of things that companies typically measure in their project delivery scorecard. Project turnover, and that's at the inception of the project. How well did we turn this over from the estimator to the project management team? Some companies, project managers and estimators are one and the same, so they don't have that turnover process. But this particular example, we have project turnover. Staffing, how well did we do on staffing? And these are scored somewhere between 0 and 10. So a 10 would be as best as possible, and a 0 would be we didn't do very well. Productivity management, and again, the productivity indicator is a great way to track that. You know, how well did we do matching the estimated productivity rates with the actual rates? How many of them did we beat? How many of them are we behind? Are there things that need to be updated in our productivity rate section for our estimates? And then the job cost setup. How well did we do in tracking job cost and reporting job cost? And how well did we do on the margin management? In other words, did we margin gain or margin fade on this particular project? Here's another big one where we see a lot of variance in today, which is the architects and engineer coordination. That's always a challenge on these projects, and getting responses today and getting quality sets of plans and specifications is a real issue. And so that A&E coordination is really important. Maintaining crew morale is another hot topic, and so you can see that they did pretty well in this particular area. But crew morale obviously affects productivity. If you have high crew morale, you're going to have better productivity. If you have a project that everybody knows is a bad job, the morale goes down. If you have a job that's got lots of rework, morale goes down, and so the productivity really takes a hit on those kinds of projects. Project team assignment, that's another one. Did we have the right team on board? Did we have them on at the right time in the particular project? And so how well did we get this project set up and staffed? Project closeout is another one where a lot of companies lose money. They don't close the projects out on time, and some of them actually will sign what they call a quick finish team at the end of a project to make sure that the last 5 or 10% of a job is closed out as efficiently as possible, because the things tend to drag at the very end and run up a lot of extra costs that could be recovered. So how well did we close out the project is another qualitative and quantitative factor that really does impact the project. Post-project reviews, and we recommend this on a lot of to a lot of contractors, and very few actually do complete these post-job reviews. But what are the things that we learned from this project, both positive and negative? What are some of the good things that happen on this project? How can we make sure those become best practices? And what are some of the things that we want to avoid in the future in terms of post-job review comments? And then the final two are obviously really important as well. Client satisfaction. Is the client satisfied with the project? And our best of class contracts do multiple client satisfaction surveys during the life of a project to make sure that they're delivering on their promises. One of my favorite contractors, instead of asking how's the job going, he always asks the crew, how are we doing on our promises to the customer? And that becomes a real important area too, as well as client satisfaction. You can have lots of strategy in the marketplace and lots of market promises for customers, but the real challenge becomes, are we delivering on those? Are we really making a difference where the rubber meets the road and delivering what we've promised to our customers? And then there's a final one that is not the last but most important one, is safety. How are we doing on project safety? So you can see that this scorecard takes into a number of factors that are important to project execution, but it's an attempt to quantify how contractors are doing in their project execution process in total. So, I mean, just to kind of wrap up here, then the integration of people, process, and technology are all aided by these key performance indicators. Most of this stuff can come or be computed right from most people's accounting system. It focuses people on the right behaviors. It's a more integrated solution in terms of taking a holistic look at operations. It provides timely and accuracy of data. It's easy to apply in most cases because most of it comes right out of the financial or accounting system. And it also sustains a long-term commitment to training and providing the kind of insight people need, and helps with a capital investment. We believe that the implementation of KPIs will result in a higher profits and higher return on investment. And so those are the ones that we thought were really important based on the team that we had there. Any questions now that we'd like to talk about?
Yes, several. So Ken, thank you very much for that informative session. And while you were talking, I actually came up with several questions that I think our viewers would be very interested in. So I'm just going to go through the list, if you don't mind.
Let's do.
Okay, so the first question. What are other indicators that companies tend to track, or are there traditional financial metrics that companies tend to use?
Okay, so the normal ratios that people look at, and I get this question a lot about what are your favorite ratios, and there's about 6 that I think are really important. So I think that the current ratio, which is current assets to current liabilities, is an important one. The quick ratio, which is more of just a sum of liquidity, cash plus accounts receivable divided by current liabilities. And then debt to worth. And debt to worth is a relationship of leverage, and so it kind of tells you how the firm's balance sheet is in terms of leverage. And those are 3 fairly traditional measures that you can benchmark against, and most bonding companies and banks use those. And then the 3 other ones that I think are real important are return on revenue. That's what is our bottom line. So if you have, in case of a construction firm, 2.5% bottom line, how does that translate to a return on investment? So return on investment's the second one. And then the final one is just return on assets, which kind of gives you a measure of leverage, again, in terms of how well you're returning on the assets that you have. So those are the more traditional ones, the ones that are more benchmarked, but again, they're downstream measurements, they're results,
Right.
and they don't necessarily drive any behaviors.
Okay. Yeah, very good. So would you recommend a combination of the upstream and downstream?
Both are important, but I think the system that you really need is one that enables contractors to take action before it's too late.
Okay.
So the timeliness, it's financial information has a perishable nature to it. And the older it gets, the worse it gets. And or not the worse it gets, but the value really diminishes as time goes on. So having timely, accurate feedback so that people can make corrections and understand what's going on, the better it is.
Okay, good. Our next question, is there any particular value or percentage of cash above what is needed to pay your expenses that you recommend contractors have, or is there something that the banks like to see?
The more the better. The more the better. Banks always appreciate seeing a highly liquid contractor, and the reason is because those contractors, have staying power. I mean, if you've got cash reserves and you're not into your line of credit, banks know that you can sustain a substantial loss or risk.
Okay.
And those firms that tend to have the liquidity don't have those. That's the unusual part. I mean, obviously they don't, but the more the better. And generally a 2-to-1 quick ratio or current ratio is standard, and a 1-to-1 quick ratio, which is cash and receivables divided by current liabilities, or those are acceptable, but the more the better.
Okay. Interesting. Very good. So question number 3. People tend to like pictures and visuals. I noticed in your presentation you had a lot of different charts. So my question here, how important are these visuals to the decision-making process? Should the contractors be coming up with these charts?
We think that they act on them sooner, and that you can post these, and they quick visual picture kind of tell the story. And so once you get used to the pictures, you can assimilate what needs to happen from the picture. And we think that drives action more, especially if you think about it if they're posted. If you had like a liquidity indicator posted, and let me just share this story with you. We worked with a large industrial contractor, and they had divisions all over the country. And their challenge was that they were underbilled a lot, and that they were into their receivables, they were into their line of credit a lot. And they actively went about teaching this liquidity indicator to all the divisions. And so they worked really hard with training these people in each one of the divisions about what was happening with accounts receivable retention and underbillings and overbillings. And they made some fundamental changes. They made sure that the schedule of values were aggressive and front-loaded, so that they could, as the project were started, that they could bill earlier on the jobs. And so they began to overbill. And within a period of about 2 years, they turned their liquidity situation around by about $12 million.
Wow.
So these are behavioral changes that once people understand the situation and what needs to happen to make that occur, it's a relatively easy change for them, because it's not, billing and collecting is not a hard science.
Sure. Very good. Okay. Question 4, how many metrics do you recommend? Because it seems like there's, going to be a point of diminishing return. Collecting data is sort of costly. So really, how much data is needed?
So I think, and that's why I mentioned 6 ratios. I think there's a handful that are important. And I think you need to figure out which handful make a difference in your business. Every business is a little bit different. And subcontractors obviously have high concentration of labor. And so they need to really manage productivity risk more than probably general contractors do. General contractors, on the other hand, need to really manage committed costs and change orders. And they're kind of the driver of that process. And so those two for that contractor would be very important.
Okay.
But, I think you're right. I think you can throw too many numbers at people and just get them confused. But if you keep it to a half a dozen, it can work.
Okay, very good. Another question. What's a good way to get started with a KPI program? I imagine that we have a lot of members who have no KPI program and don't really keep these indicators. What have you seen? How do people get started?
So I think it's really important for you to figure out what's important for your business, and where are some of the areas that you may not be performing well, and try and identify what you're having trouble with. If it's project execution, maybe those project execution indicators. But try and identify the few things that really are going to make a difference in your business and that you're really struggling with. It could be backlog. Backlog is one that a lot of contractors struggle with, selling and getting work. And so what are those things that you need to do to enhance your backlog building process? What can we do to sell projects for a higher margin? And so there, it's individual contractor, but just need to identify what are those things that are important to fix.
Okay.
Or improve.
Okay, good. Kind of along the same lines, this is a practical question. Can these different metrics be set up in Excel? Or, I mean, where do the companies tend to get the data? They pull it from their accounting system, or do they collect it,
Correct.
like physically
Yeah,
collect it?
correct. And of course, Microsoft would love you buy their software.
Sure.
That's one of the points that they made. But the answer is it can be set up in Excel and exported from your accounting software. You have to, first of all, it's like with a schedule. If you don't have a schedule that you're tracking on and really keeping up to date, you're not going to be able to do the project schedule indicator.
Sure.
The variance indicator. So some of those things have got to exist, but if they exist, you can set them up in an Excel spreadsheet and download them from the accounting system. Schedule is one that would come from the accounting system,
Sure.
but you can see. And the other ones, like the, looking at the project scorecard, those are things that are more subjective and quantitative, which you have to prepare
Physically
manually.
get the data.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So there's different degrees of...
Different degrees.
And that leads into the next question, which is, I'm wondering how the best-in-class companies have found ways to automate data collection, because it takes a lot of time to actually go out and physically collect data.
And that's an evolutionary process. It's getting better every day. You find people that are entering time on mobile apps, and it's entered daily.
Okay.
Data's being captured daily. Same thing with job cost. And again, we go back to that perishability of information. The closer it is to when it happened, it tends to be more accurate and more useful. And so the best of class firms have good accounting systems. They have current technology. They're using good, the technology applications, and not just accounting, but also in project execution, things like Trimble, project layout. Building information modeling is very prevalent today, and prefabrication. So the best of class contractors, not just information, but they're trying to stay ahead of all of the trends that are occurring in construction.
Okay, interesting. My final question, you talked about a capital investment, and I'm wondering if there's a right amount of investment to develop a KPI system?
I would just go back to it varies by firm. But the answer is that if you really do think about the things that matter in your business and what really it is important to track, and where are some of those areas that you're not performing very well, improving in those areas would make a big difference. And so it would justify some investment. You obviously are not going to throw $100,000 to save 10, but I think a strategic approach to KPIs and what do we really need to measure, what are going to drive those right behaviors in our organization, would be a very productive thing to do. Okay. And so a high level of investment would be justifiable.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks very much. Well, that's it for our webcast today. This concludes the webcast on key performance indicators, part of the Impact webcast series on growing a business. Ken previously completed a webcast on collections and getting paid. Please take the time to see Ken's other webcasts, which can be located on our website. Thank you for joining us today.